All right, welcome back. We'll start our discussion of parity relationships through purchasing power parity. So we've talked about law of one price as it applies to currencies and forward transactions. Right, where I have a currency, I trade it for a higher yielding currency, I earn a higher interest rate, I sell that currency forward back to my original currency. Right, so that's a law of one price with respect to those two currencies, because that forward rate needs to be set a particular way so that when you go back, you just end up where you would have been if you would have just invested domestically. So that's law of one price with forwards. And then we did law of one price with expected future spot rates, which isn't it's not an arbitrage condition, but it's something that should kind of hold generally, right? You can if it doesn't hold for long term, then you can make money using forwards. And if you know that the expected future spot is consistently different than the forward rate, you can just buy whichever one is cheaper and sell whichever one is expensive and make profit over time. So these law of one price-ish discussion will be kind of like that spirit, that vein, where we're going to think about, rather than a currency that has expected future spot rates that are different, we'll be thinking about a consumption basket. So if purchasing power parity holds, it would be true that the exchange rate between two currencies from two different countries should be equal to the ratio of the country's price levels out of a commodity basket. Right? So if we think about, if I've got copper, uranium, rough rice, and Brent crude, and those all have prices in dollars, and they all have prices in Australian dollars, it should be true that if all of that stuff is twice as expensive in Australia, then all of that stuff, then the Australian dollar should be half as expensive to purchase to make it all kind of even out. Now, it doesn't really work like that. There are local differences in how expensive things are, but obviously, in general, there is some pressure. There is some pressure to make those exchange rates line up, because if Australia is if all of the commodities in Australia are half price and the currencies are the same, if they trade one for one, but commodities are half price. Well, if I'm a commodity producer, why would I sell in the Australian market? It doesn't make sense. I would sell in the American market, because I end up I get basically twice as much value. And so, I wouldn't do that. So what I would do instead is, if the prices are appropriate, then you're just this 1/6 of one, half a dozen of the other, right? I get my currency's on sale, but the stuff is expensive. Now, and that's a good way to think about it too, because those examples, if I'm talking about oil, well, I can't just go buy oil in Australia and get it to the United States for free, right? It's got to cross the Pacific, go through the Panama Canal, right? I mean, there's a lot of work to do to capitalize on that purchasing power parity difference, and so it's entirely plausible that price differentials between something heavy and slow and difficult to transport, it's very plausible that differences can exist between two places for something like that. Where it's not as possible for gold, right? It's super easy to put gold on a boat, send it around, right? Like computer chips. In the U.S., I think a good example in the U.S. that you can see is cars. So even within the United States, we have some purchasing power parity differences, right? So it's very expensive to build things, on the coasts. It's right. It's expensive to get, so food tends to be a little more expensive. We have, contracting services are quite a bit more, right? So like a $20,000 roof in San Diego, it's like a $5,000 roof in Wisconsin. So you have all these things that are all, quite a bit more expensive. And that makes sense because you can't, right? Why? Because a Californian could say, well, I should just buy a Wisconsin roof. Well, that's not a thing. Like, you can't buy a Wisconsin roof and then send the roof over. You can't do that. But you can for a car, right? So a car, you can buy a car in Wisconsin and drive it to California. I mean, it might cost you $1,000 to transport it, but there's kind of a limit to how much that can matter. And so, so my experience when I lived in San Diego actually was like, right in San Diego, so many things were so expensive, and that also meant that the companies had to pay higher wages. And so what that meant in effect was that San Diego had this purchasing power parity difference where, from their perspective, stuff in Wisconsin all over the place was just really cheap, right? But that wasn't true for cars, right? So for San Diegans, a car costs them about as much as it costs a Wisconsinite to buy a car. And so as a proportion of their overall consumption basket, cars were pretty small, right? Like you could buy a nicer car and end up having it be the same percentage of your income, and they definitely did, right? So the cars, the typical car driving around a San Diego street is quite a bit flashier, and there's more, right? I saw, an F-350 extra long bed dually, truck lowered about 2 inches from the ground, right? I've never seen anything like that in Wisconsin. I mean, it's also not really practical here, but, it's just not, it doesn't, right? In San Diego, that kind of money would have bought a third of a bedroom. In Wisconsin, it probably buys 2 bedrooms, right? So we just tend to spend it on other things instead, right? So there are purchasing power parity differences even in the United States. But that means that, that in general, though, that over time, these things should kind of normalize, other than all of the the transportation boundaries that prevent it. Right? So in the absolute version of the purchasing power parity, it should be true that the ratio of the prices dictate the exchange rate. Now that's a lot stronger than reality, right? There's lots of violations of absolute PPP in real life, and that's why, in the U.S. states, if you go to India, you really can, buy things, especially services, for quite a bit cheaper. But they're still, even then, right? If it were so cheap, then people would, utilize that more often. Okay, so now we get into sort of this. That's absolute PPP. So taking that thinking, we can think about it in a relative sense. So think about changes, right? So if I have, right, since the spot pay should be, the exchange rate should be roughly equal to the purchasing power parity ratio. If there's changes, right? So if there's changes in prices, those changes in prices should show up as a change in the exchange rate. And so that's what we have here. So if we, if you do the math for changing these prices, it'll flow down to be this, right? So I have we have an inflation rate in the dollar here, minus an inflation rate in the pound, over 1 plus the inflation rate in the pound. And right, so that's approximately equal to inflation dollars minus inflation pounds, because right, inflation in the pound should be pretty small, maybe 1%. So this is very, very close, right? So if U.S. inflation is 4% and British inflation is 1%, this numerator is going to be 3%, and then we're going to divide by 1.01. Well, that's approximately 3%. Right? So again, this is approximate. This is the one that's closer. But that means in general we can think about, right, if the dollar is inflating at 4% and the pound is inflating at 1%, we would expect the exchange rate to drift by 3%, right? And against the dollar, right? Against the dollar. As in it would decline in value relative to the pound if it has higher inflation than the pound. So if purchasing power parity doesn't hold, changes in nominal exchange rates cause changes in real exchange rates. So we have so nominal, right? Nominal meaning after inflation and real meaning before. So right, so we have, all right, so here's our inflation, right? Here's our inflation and here's our other inflation. And we know, right, that so E is connected up with this exchange rate change. So right, if this is right, so if the dollar is inflating at 4% and the pound is inflating at 1%, and the exchange rate is drifting at 3%, this will be roughly equal to 1.04, and this will be roughly equal to 1.04, and that means Q will be equal to 1. And so if purchasing parity is real, then Q is 1. But if it's not true, then Q could be something else. And that would mean, a difference. The real exchange rate doesn't follow that, purchasing parity. And this is, of course, true. Lots of, Q isn't 1. And it's, often a great to read due to legal frictions and capital restrictions and all sorts of stuff. So, right, so I've meant, so PPP generally doesn't hold because of non-tradable, non-standardized goods, shipping costs, tariffs, and quotas. But PPP determined exchange rates provide a benchmark. It's a good way to sort of say, this is kind of what we would expect to see in terms of the exchange rate difference between these places, relative, other than these other factors that matter. So, for example, The Economist, they have a Big Mac index where they just look up the price of a Big Mac in countries all over the planet, and then they, you can look at the exchange rate relative to the cost of the Big Mac, and you can see that it's not perfect, right there. If you're a United States citizen, there are places you can travel to where you can get a Big Mac cheaper than you can in the United States, and there's places where you go and it's more expensive. But also that Big Mac index is kind of helpful for thinking about, if you look at the prices, prices in a Big Mac that, speaks to, right? Like think about if it's 400 yen to buy a Big Mac, well, obviously the yen must be worth significantly less than the dollar, but it might be true that that's still cheaper. It would depend on the exchange rate, right? So why does this matter? Well, again, if you're in a country that has low purchasing power parity, right, or high purchasing power. So like if you have high purchasing power, then your overall wealth will feel larger than it actually is on an exchange rate basis, right? So maybe a good way to think about it is like everywhere all over the planet are people that hold currency. And one thing we can do is we could say, hey, let's all of us buy gold and see who has the most gold. Well, that's the thing on the left, right? The U.S. could, Americans can buy the most gold of anybody, right? But if we do this differently and think about non-tradable, non-standardized goods, right, all these things, right? So let's say, well, how many haircuts and massages and amusement park rides can you get with your money? Well, in that case, then China actually outranks the United States in terms of total, right? So the total amount of gold, we can buy more gold than they can with our economy, but they can buy more like stuff people use than we can with their economy. And that has to do with, right, on a monetary value, they're behind, but your money goes a lot farther in China. I mean, this has been a while, but when I taught, I taught in Beijing in 2009 and 2010, and the bus fare in Beijing was, I think it was like 8 cents, maybe 6 cents. And I just took taxis. You think, riding taxis all over the place in a major metro, that should just be crazy, crazy expensive. But, it was like 3 renminbi flag drop, and then it would be like 0.7 renminbi per mile. So again, it was 7 renminbi to the dollar. So it was like your cab was like a 60-cent flag drop, and then 40 cents a mile. So yeah, I just took cabs all over, and it was really cheap. It didn't really feel like much of anything. So that's that purchasing power parity, effect, right? Where, we're actually by that standard, China's largest economy. And Russia, there's this huge difference, right? So in Russia, there's and this is even, probably even more different now that we have, the Ukraine conflict. But, Russia, in terms of how much, gold can we buy, is very, very low. But in terms of the actual like stuff you can do on a purchasing power parity adjusted basis, is the 6th largest economy in the world. And right, there's a huge, a good, it's like 2% of Russian GDP is home vegetable gardens. So it's, it's like free. So you get all your stuff from your garden, and then, so anyway, that's very, very different. So, and this matters a lot when we think about success in Europe. So, Norway, the Norwegians have tons of money, right? They have all that oil money. But they are very, very protectionist about their domestic industry, right? When Christmas they had like a butter crisis because, there were hard caps on how much butter could come from outside the country, and the domestic production had issues that year or whatever. So everyone's trying to cook for Christmas, and no one can get any butter, and that was by design, right? They wanted to be sure that there were domestic industries in Norway for all sorts of stuff. And that meant doing, right. So there's, I guess, inherently just a little bit of inefficiency there, right? If you're in a country full of fjords, it's pretty hard to raise cattle in that environment. And so if you're thinking about, specialization for economic purposes, and say, oh, maybe we'll just let somebody else do that. Let's let they can do cattle in the Netherlands, and we'll do something else. And that would be more economically efficient, in the sense that, the oil wealth would then translate into more things, right? More things, because it's been allocated efficiently at the expense of, then there's no, or Norwegian dairy farmers or whatever. So because Norway's committed to some, basically preserving a bunch of domestic industry, that drives up the cost of goods for Norwegians. And that means at the end of the day, actually, that Norwegians, in terms of quality of life, lag behind a lot of other European countries, even though they have, this enormous wealth per person. And it's just, it's a consequence of everything being so expensive. And Spain is the opposite, right? So in Spain, the monetary value of, like you could do, if you work, you get a job in Spain, your salary is terrible, but then everything is super, super cheap. And so at the end of the day, it's actually, pretty competitive with Norway in terms of what you get on a PPP adjusted basis. Okay, so So these PPP relationships are important. They don't hold very strongly, but they do sort of matter. It's kind of like you can think about it as maybe a force that's sort of pulling exchange rates to each other, and there are other forces that can drive a wedge and make it even farther, but there's kind of just this general gravity towards having purchasing power parity line up across countries. Okay, another thing we need to talk about is the Fisher effect. So the Fisher effect holds that an increase in infected inflation in a country will cause a proportionate increase in the interest rate in that country. Okay? And a decrease in infected inflation will cause a decrease in the interest rate. So what is this coming from? So this it's like this, right? Because we have, all right. So right, the interest rate. This sort of comes out, right? So we have like 1 plus the nominal interest rate is equal to 1 plus the real rate times 1 plus expected inflation. But if you multiply that all out, then you get, we're going to get rid of the 1, and then you get, right, so then you get real rate, expected inflation, and then real rate times expected inflation. But this, right, should be small. This should be small. So you have small times small, and so that means approximately interest, right? Interest is composed of the real rate of interest and the expected inflation, right? So if inflation expectations go up, interest rates go up. And that's what we see in the United States, right? So for the longest time, the federal government had an inflation target, the Federal Reserve had an inflation target of 2% that it kept for forever, but inflation was consistently coming in at 0.5% for a long time. And so then if you're a bank thinking about doing mortgage lending, you can say, well, we've had this 0.5% inflation for a long time. So maybe I'm just going to assume that inflation is going to be maybe 1% long term. So I can afford to do a 3.5% mortgage because that still leaves me 2.5% of real returns to work with to sell to a government's, sponsored entity like Freddie Mac or to keep in house to earn money or whatever. Right. So if my internal belief about the long-term expected inflation in the United States is 1%, then it makes sense to do mortgage lending at 3.5%. But if my belief that the long-term expected inflation rate in the United States is 4%, well, you can't do loan lending at 3.5 if you expect inflation is 4%. Your money is literally melting before you. If you think, I can get $400,000 of Big Macs, but I'll invest it in a mortgage instead, and then after your mortgage exists for 7 years, and you go to try buy Big Macs, and you go, oh my goodness, the amount of Big Macs I can get has gone down. Right? Why didn't I just buy the burgers in the first place? Right. So that's right. So that means, right, it means inherently that when loans are set and those interest rates are set on loans, implicitly there's an inflation expectation. So that's why, right, if you think about, we just recently went through a period of very high inflation, and the central bank was very clear about, this is temporary phenomenon. This is this transitory was the language they used. And then now that it's persisted for longer and is somewhat resurgent of late, then, that's going to naturally feed into higher interest rates. And that is in fact what has occurred, right? So at the time of this video, the savings rates went from, about 0 to, something like 5. Mortgages went from, low 3s to, 7s. And right. And so, and it follows from the way, interest it's constructed. So that's what we have. This is all within one country, right? This is all within one country. So if we think about expected inflation rate, right? So it implies that the expected inflation rate is the difference between the nominal and real interest rate in each country, right? So my expected inflation, right? So if I have a real rate of 2% and an interest rate of 4%, or sorry, 6%, then my inflation is going to be roughly 4, right? 6 minus 2 is 4. And then if this is, right, and if this interest is 4, then it would be 4 minus 2 is 2. Right? So that's just this equation restated for two different currencies, right? It's just literally the same thing twice with different right, sub indices. But now we're going to play a game that's important, right? We're going to assume that real rates are equal across countries. And that would make sense, right? If I am investing my money and I can get a 2% after inflation return in one country and a 3% after inflation return in another country, I would prefer the 3% one. And so that currency would flow into that one, exchange rates would drift. It's a global, right? Basically, the money and investing is a global marketplace. And so the after inflation returns that people should expect should be, should be equal, right? Again, each currency is different. They all have their own inflation rate. And so they're going to have their own nominal interest rate. But that doesn't mean that basically investors will be looking for some return on top of whatever to cover for inflation. So if that's true, we can do this sub, right? So we say, okay, what if I do this minus this? Well, then it would be I dollars minus I pounds, and then it would be negative real dollars minus negative, which would be plus real pounds. But these are the same number, so that's just going to cancel. That'll just cancel. And so, and right, if even over here in this formulation, right, if these are the same, it doesn't even really matter. I guess it's in the denominator, but so that means, if we stick with this approximate formulation, then you would get this, dollars pounds, right? So the expected difference in inflation would be approximately equal to the difference in interest rates, right? So, so it's an international Fisher effect. Nominal interest rate differential reflects the expected change in the exchange rate, right? Because it reflects the right? So the difference in the interest rates gets you the difference in the expected inflation rates. And then, right, going back to here, we have the difference in inflation rates leading to the change in the exchange rate, right? So we're combining, right? If we have the purchasing power parity version of stuff and then we combine it with the Fisher effect, you get this international Fisher effect. So differences in nominal interest rates reflect the expected difference in exchange, the expected change in the exchange rate. And so now if we combine, right, so if you combine the Fisher effect with interest rate parity, right, so now so this is all just based on, expected exchange rate change. But we can actually lock in an exchange rate change with a forward, right? We can lock it in with a forward. And so if we, right, so we have, right, so this is our change in the exchange rate, right? Change in the exchange rate. And so so this, you've got, right, we stick in getting this forward in that allows us to transact now on a future transaction means that we can have this, this expected drift in the exchange rate connects to this change in the forward rate and also the expected future spot rate, but we're not talking about that right now. So you end up with kind of this network, right? This network of things. So we have, right? So we from and again, it depends a lot on, right? So the interest rate parity, those are pretty solid relationships, right? That's arbitrage based. So this connection's pretty strong. So the difference in interest rates should strongly relate to the forward committed drift in exchange rates. And we have the Fisher effect. So we get from this difference in interest rates stemming from a difference in expected inflation, which in the assumption there is that you have that the real rates are the same, and which just means, basically we've got a global market for capital. So we kind of, so we have these different beliefs that are connected through these relationships that have certain assumptions, right? So this one is this arbitrage, the law of one price assumption, whereas this one is that real rates are the same, whereas this one is that currencies should tend over time to have exchange rates that reflect price differentials. And that one's pretty weak, right? So this assumption, right? So this doesn't work so well. This one works really well. This one works kind of well, right? And so yes, you'll get, kind of a different level of confidence or reliability in all of these different parity relationships. So that's kind of the big penultimate summary of how all these things work. And again, I think the biggest surprising fact out of all of this, maybe there's a couple, but one major one is that if you have two currencies and one of which is a higher yielding currency, it has to mechanically depreciate relative to the lower yielding currency. And I really struggled with that for a long time. I thought, how could it possibly be true that if you want your currency to get strong relative to another currency, you lower your interest rate? That seems like the opposite of true. And the way I've resolved this mentally, and I think this is real, I think this makes sense actually, is that what we're describing here is what happens over time. So you're kind of saying, okay, what if I want my currency to grow relative to other currency, I would lower the interest rate. Well, yes, if you lower the interest rate, then the forward stuff will mechanically make your currency appreciate. But what's going to happen when you lower your rates? Your spot rates are going to crater, right? So it's kind of like saying, oh, I want to be taller than this other thing, so I'm going to dig a giant hole and climb in it, and then I can see myself getting taller all the time as I carve steps into the walls. Well, yes, but when you dropped the interest rate, you created that giant hole, and that your exchange rate is going to crash. And then, yes, you'll slowly climb out, but that doesn't, that may not. Again, the lowering your rate isn't a solution to strengthening your currency. Lowering your rate is a recipe for needing to strengthen your currency. So that's kind of how I resolve that for myself. So in the in the next section, we'll talk about a little bit about forecasting exchange rates.